Welcome. And please indicate TPM before your name for credit points. Thank you. Right. Thank you for spending the afternoon with TPAS via this Zoom presentation. Seah Liang Seah, King of the Streets by Baba Shawn Seah. Before we start, some housekeeping. All participants will be muted. Kindly post any questions in the chat box. At the end of the presentation, we will do our best to answer all questions. Before we go into the presentation, let me introduce myself. I'm Gwen Ong from the Peranakan Association, Singapore. TPAS is a volunteer association, the beacon of the Peranakan culture, serving with passion and commitment. For those who have not joined us as members, kindly consider to do so. It's a one-time membership fee. Get in touch with us to join, or you may click on the link. Okay, my colleague will share it with you a little later. At the same time, do subscribe to our YouTube channel to enable the uploading of informative videos. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Coming up, mark your calendar, the dates. We are sharing with you upcoming interesting events in August. In celebration of Singapore's National Day, TPAS brings you Main Turkey, Zoom online lessons with Nonya Benita Fong. For a kind donation of $10, local postage included, 2 packs of turkey cards will be mailed out to you. However, we have an option to just view lessons online without the cards. Second presentation, Miss Leslie Pullen will be presenting her fascinating research on patterns that are evident on medieval Javanese sculptures. These patterns have influenced our current batik designs. She will be presenting her Zoom all the way from UK. So please join us on the 21st of August. Now, one other event that's not listed, that's listed here is 25th of September, which is our virtual Peranakan dinner. It's a fundraiser for the association. So for full details and tickets, kindly email to events@peranakan.org.sg. Now, this dinner would be interesting because we have celebrity chefs such as Violet Oon, Sylvia Tan, and Christopher Tan that will whip up their culinary master dishes together with the chefs of Shangri-La Kitchen to have dinner delivered to you at home to share during the virtual dinner. So get in touch with us for tickets. So TPAS looks forward to all joining us for the above online events. Now let's get into this afternoon's program. I personally have stayed in Hougang for more than 20 years and went to primary and secondary school at Hougang area. However, I must admit, I've never researched the historical aspect of Hougang. Before I start and hand it over to Shawn, first, congratulations are in order to Baba Shawn Seah, who is a proud father of baby daughter Sarah. And his book, My Father's Kampong, has been shortlisted by the Singapore Book Publishers Association for the Best Non-Fiction Title of Singapore Book Awards 2021. Congrats to Shawn. Now, it gives me great pleasure to have author and speaker Baba Shawn Seah to share with us the life story of Seah Liang Seah and his connection with Hougang, and a founding member of the Straits Chinese British Association, which eventually became known as the Peranakan Association. Over to you, Shawn.
Okay, thanks for that wonderful introduction, Gwen. I hope I will live up to it. Hi, everybody. I'm Shawn. Thanks for that wonderful introduction again. I mean, oh, that was really awesome. I was very surprised. Thank you. Yeah, so I've been quite lucky to be nominated for the best non-fiction title and managed to get into the final. That's probably not thanks to my skill, but to the good support of the community who's lent their weight to help me. If you guys would like to do so, you can go online. I think the Singapore Book Publishers Association, they have a Reader's Choice Award, which is up for voting. So if you like, yeah, that might be something you could vote for me. So don't vote for me for president, vote for me to win the Reader's Choice. I think for an author that matters more. So before I begin, I'd just like to bring attention to the title. The title of today's talk is Seah Liang Seah, King of the Streets. So I actually got a WhatsApp message from someone who asked me, does this mean that they were a bunch of gangsters, big Tauke, right, King of the Streets? No, actually the title comes from an article written by Linda, who wrote about the crazy rich babas of yesteryear, and the title was Seah Liang Seah, King of the Streets in the Peranakan magazine, which I love to read, so you should all read it as well. So that's where we got the inspiration for the title. Actually, I've spoken on this topic several times, so I thought I would try to make it a little bit interesting this time, and hopefully not bore the many people who have kindly listened to me patiently over the years. I first talked about Seah Eu Chin, the father of Seah Liang Seah, in 2017 at the Peranakan Museum. And the docents there kindly supported the talk by coming down to listen to me when I was launching my first book. In 2019, I also spoke at the Peranakan Museum as well on Seah Liang Seah, and that's when I launched my second book. I was also kindly invited by the Peranakan Association to talk at the Baba Nonya Literary Festival, where I was on a panel with people like Ekeng and Vivian Tan, who wrote that wonderful book on Tan Kim Seng. So that was very meaningful for me. So I've had a long association with the Peranakan Association and the Peranakan Museum. I've written 4 books, or rather I've written 3 books. The first one, Seah Eu Chin, His Life and Times, was kindly translated into Chinese for my Chinese fans. So apparently I have a lot of Chinese fans. I think what's really surprising is that I have a bigger Chinese fan base than I have English-speaking fans. Yeah. So from time to time, they will abuse me by asking me to speak in Mandarin, which I really suck at. So it's quite a challenge. But I do what I can to reach out to people to share my family story. Okay. So today, actually, I wanted to focus more on Seah Liang Seah's life and times. So although I could talk a little bit about Hougang, I'll be focusing more on Seah Liang Seah's life and times and questions of his identity, because I often get the question of whether he was Peranakan or not. I'm going to keep the sharing informal, so it's just going to be me talking and sharing. It's not going to be very serious and detailed. It's not one of those very academic talks, I'm afraid to add. So if you're looking for that, maybe you can reserve your questions at the end, because there will be Q&A. I find that the dialogue and the conversations part can be quite interesting. So feel free at the end of the talk to have any questions you might want to raise. So instead, what I'll be doing is covering a quick sketch of points from my book, but I'll also be talking a little bit about the journey that of exploration I've been on. Today's topic is, as I mentioned, Seah Liang Seah. He was a son of Singapore, 1850 to 1925. So I'll be covering around this period, but I'll also be talking a little bit, to surround that with context. I used to give this talk regularly, and given the fact that I use Zoom so often, I should be very familiar. But I'm a dinosaur, so sometimes there might be some tech issue or I might say something wrong. So please put up with me, okay? You can criticize me later at the Q&A. Okay, so maybe we begin with his birth, okay? So in 1850, Seah Liang Seah was born in Singapore. I once went to SJI and I saw this beautiful picture which I took, and I put it up here. This portrait, I believe, was the old SJI, which today is the Singapore Art Museum. I put it up because when Seah Liang Seah was very young, he actually studied English at SJI. His father, of course, the king of Gambia and Pepper, Mr. Seah Eu Chin, was more Chinese speaking, Teochew speaking. So at home, Seah Eu Chin would speak Teochew and teach Teochew to his son. But in school, Seah Liang Seah would learn English at SGI. After a while of homeschooling as well as in Chinese and school schooling in terms of English, Seah Eu Chin later on at the age of 17 years old took over the business from his father. So he went into the Gambia and pepper business first. Later on, he went into pineapple growing, but the fella, being a genius, realized that there wasn't much money to be made in pineapples because there was another gentleman by the name of Mr. Lim Nee Soon who was already the pineapple king. So Seah Liang Seah decided that why don't I go upstream? You know, I go up market. I'll have value added, and he went instead into pineapple processing. So he put the pineapple into cans, tinned them, and then exported them. And then for that, he became very successful and very wealthy. And later on, he moved into the rubber industry. What I like about his life story is that it reflects the Singapore economy in those days. Before the 1840s and 50s, so in the earlier part of the 19th century, actually Singapore's agricultural industry was mainly focused on Gambia and pepper. So at that time, they did that. Basically, the Seah family was in Gambia and pepper. And as I've mentioned, Seah Eu Chin, his father, was called the Gambia and Pepper King. Gambia and pepper were grown together because pepper is basically takes a long time to grow. Pepper basically takes a long time to grow. So what you'd want to do is you want to augment it with Gambia. Gambia grows faster. So at the same time, you can make money from Gambia, but when the Gambia is growing, you can make money from the pepper. So it was a very strategic way of doing it. Teochews had been in this business for a very long time. Some say they brought it to Singapore from the Riau Islands, where they were already doing it since the 18th century, even earlier. And so basically, Seah Liang Seah and his father were entering a very Teochew-dominated industry. It was something that they've been doing for a long time. But later, because Gambia and pepper tended to exhaust the soil and make it very difficult for you to grow on it thereafter, they needed more and more tracts of land. And so Gambia essentially moved upward and went to Malaya. So it went to Johor. So that happened in the 1850s and 60s. So as a result, Singapore moved into other areas like pineapple. And then later, around the turn of the century, went into rubber. So what I like about Seah Liang Seah's life story is that from 17 years onwards, he took on his father's business, and basically his whole industry experience revolved around what were the agricultural crops that were being grown as cash crops for the international economy. So in a certain sense, his life was tied with the Singapore economic cycle, so to speak. This is an artist's impression of one of his plantations, the Chin Chun plantations, which I'm told is around 80 over acres. So it was a fairly large one. Last year, during COVID, we had the Singapore Heritage Festival, and I was surprised to find that someone featured one of the pictures in my book here. So over here, you can see basically artist's impression of what the houses and the properties looked like that was surrounding the plantations at the time. So this one appeared on what to do during Phase 2 weekend, 3rd to 5th July, brings back fond memories. Okay, but it wasn't all just about making money for this gentleman. So Seah Liang Seah was also a community leader. He succeeded his father in the Ni An Kong Si. The Ni An Kong Si, which was established in 1845, was a welfare organization for the burial, religious, and welfare needs of the Teochew community. I thought I should emphasize this point because I get this very often. People will ask, is the Ni An Kong Si a gangster organization? Is it a secret society? So no, the secret society people were the Ni Heng Kong Si, so easily confused. So there was a Ni Heng Kong Si, similarly named, and they were largely classified by the British as gangsters, or secret society would be more accurate. But the Ni An Kong Si is a bit different. The Ni An Kong Si was a welfare organization set up for the benefit of Teochews, because when they were migrants coming to early developing Singapore, it was very hard for them to take care of their welfare and their benefits. So it actually follows an earlier organization in 1830, where Seah Eu Chin founded with other Teochew clan leaders. So 1845 was the official founding of the Ni An Kong Si. Seah Liang Seah was not the eldest son of Seah Eu Chin. He was the second son, but he took over his father because shortly after the father's death in 1883, the eldest son, unfortunately, the eldest son passed away. He passed away in 1885. So in 1885, Seah Liang Seah essentially took over the seat. By being the leader of the Niyang Kongsi, essentially it meant that Seah Liang Seah was the community leader of the entire Teochew community. He was basically the representative of the Teochews. In 1883, Seah Liang Seah became the first Singapore-born Chinese to become a member of the Legislative Council of the Straits Settlements. For some historical context-wise, in those days, power was, of course, concentrated in the hands of the British colonial masters. Of course, they were the rulers, but the governor cannot run the place by himself, right? So the governor essentially was supported by two organizations. Okay, I'm a boring person, so I find this interesting. The governor was supported by the Executive Council as well as the Legislative Council. So they helped him make decisions, and basically they helped him run the colony. In this case, Singapore was a crown colony as part of the Straits Settlements. So the British governor basically had to jaga these three territories of Malacca, Penang, and Singapore. So there was a slot reserved in the Legislative Council for a Chinese member, and usually the Chinese member would come from Singapore. So I get asked about this quite often also, so I thought I'll just preempt it and just share. The first Chinese member of the Legislative Council wasn't Seah Liang Seah. The first Chinese member was Whampoa. But what's really interesting for us, especially myself as a Singaporean, is that Seah Liang Seah was the first Singapore-born Chinese member of the Legislative Council. So what does that actually mean in practice? I'd like to share a bit more about that. That is one of the inspirations and motivations behind why I do what I do about my writing. And that is because I feel that we have a Singapore history to tell. Whampoa, who was the first Chinese member of the Legislative Council, was born in China. After that, he came to Singapore and he had a successful career here, there's no doubt about it, and he became a Legislative Council member. Thereafter, he even became a member of the Executive Council, the one I mentioned earlier. So you can tell that this guy was a high flyer, he was rising really quickly. But what I find interesting is that the gentleman was essentially Chinese through and through. He believed in China. He was just a migrant. And we see that in many areas of his life. For example, when Whampoa's son came back from the UK as a Christian and having cut off his pigtail, Whampoa was so shocked he sent the gentleman back to China for re-education on how to be a Chinese. When Whampoa passed away in Singapore, his remains went back to China and he was buried back home in his home village. I think that is a fair and a reasonable thing to do. But as you can see from the examples I've given, basically the difference is Whampoa saw himself as Chinese. But for Seah Liang Seah, it's a different story. Seah Liang Seah was born in Singapore, he settled down and he made good here and he wanted to stay. So appointing him as the first Singapore-born member of the Legislative Council is a little bit more meaningful to us in terms of our Singapore story. To me, the Singapore story isn't just some high-level story, that the government imposes on its citizens. The Singapore story is the story of how our people, the people who made Singapore their home, they lived here and interacted, and they contributed to society. And so that's a little diversion of what I wanted to share. For those of you who are interested in the position of the unofficial member of the Legislative Council, it was a pretty badass position to be in, because although it was reserved for a Chinese, basically this gentleman who sat in this position, the Legislative Council of the Straits Settlements, he would represent all the Asiatics, all the Asians in the Straits Settlements, both that means in Malacca, Penang, and Singapore as well. So it was quite interesting to be in that seat. All right. The next topic I want to talk about very quickly is to paint a broad picture about parties at Bendemeer House. I was told it's very popular. A couple of years ago in 2019, a newspaper article came out, right? And I think the title was called The Original Crazy Rich Asian. It was an article written in the Straits Times by Melody Zacchaeus. So can you imagine, I wrote a story on the Seah Liang Seah, and I was writing about his achievements, his contributions to Singapore, and what's the link with the Singapore identity and all that. And the newspaper reported on it, and the headline was all about the parties at Bendemeer House, And so I thought it would be interesting to share about it since people were really interested. And I got a lot of calls from this one. You know, my colleagues at work called me up and said, "Hey, didn't know your ancestors were so cool." So, well, at Bendemeer House, which was actually designed and built by Whampoa, the gentleman I described earlier, Bendemeer House was actually called Whampoa's house. Whampoa owned it, he built it. And he had a beautiful garden and a lot of sweeping lands and had a very high tower at the back. The house was interesting because it reflected very Southeast Asian influences. You've got British, Chinese, Malay, and European architecture all woven in together. So it's pretty unique. After Whampoa's death, his children weren't able really to afford the house, and in 1895 they sold it to Seah Liang Seah. So Seah Liang Seah became the new owner. He reopened the house and had a lot of exciting parties there. A consummate diplomat, Seah Liang Seah hosted parties with people like the King of Siam, today's Thailand, the governor of the Straits Settlements, and their partners, as well as their friends and families. Yeah, he had all sorts of exciting things going on. There were miniature golf, there was a shooting competition, there was croquet, there was even a driving competition in his house. One of the oddest parties he had, I found, was this very strange competition where you have to guess a song, but the problem is the other person is whistling the tune while having a biscuit in his mouth. So that made it very difficult to recognize the tune. And if you won, the governor's wife, Lady Madam Young, would be giving you the prizes, much like Vanna White in the Wheel of Fortune. To add to the fun, because as I mentioned, he loved shooting. Once he even shot and a crocodile, not at this mansion, I believe, at another one of his many mansions, he shot the crocodile. So this guy lived a really exciting life, with guns, golf clubs, cars. He lived a high life. It was pretty exciting. Yeah, later you can ask me more about it. I thought that was quite fun. But he didn't just own all the exciting properties to himself. His children also own exciting properties as well. Seah Eu Chin, one of Seah Liang Seah's children, owned land on which stood the Sembawang Hot Spring. So Seah Eu Chin, born in 1873, was one of Seah Liang Seah's many children. Okay, in those days, no television. So he had 6 sons and 6 daughters. And he had 3 wives. 3 wives, 6 sons and 6 daughters. So one of his many kids, Seah Eu Chin, who was a famous entrepreneur in those days, a merchant, he opened up the Sembawang Hot Spring. Basically, he bottled the water for sale. And it made him quite a lot of money. And actually, I just wanted to share this as well. History is relevant to the present because before the COVID-19 pandemic, actually the Sembawang Hot Spring was redeveloped and opened. So it's actually open to the public. I wouldn't advise you going there nowadays because of COVID, but when COVID's over, I think it's definitely worth a visit. I wrote a piece about it and shared on the internet on Facebook. First discovered in 1908 on Teochew merchant Seah Eu Chin's land, the spring's mineral-rich water was once bottled for sale by the entrepreneurial Seah. As we enjoy the only hot spring on mainland Singapore, hopefully we can also appreciate its longer history. So worth a visit, okay? Better than TripAdvisor, I tell you, this one definitely worth a visit. So having covered a lot of interesting and anecdotal snippets about his life, his work, his contributions to society, as well as his life at home and his children, I want to share something a bit more serious because I get this question very often too. So the question is, and it's relevant for the Peranakan Association, was Seah Liang Seah Peranakan or was he Chinese? Okay, so depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. Some people say clearly this guy was a Baba, and other people say clearly this guy was a Chinese man. So to unravel this mystery, we examine some evidence and context. As I said, I'll keep it informal, even though I'm trying to make it academic, because otherwise no fun, right? So fact number 1, Seah Liang Seah's mother was the daughter of the Kapitan Cina of Perak. So the Kapitan Cina of Perak was basically the gentleman who kept the Chinese community in check when they were in Perak. So the Kapitan Cina, the captain of the Chinese there, he had been there for some time. I think he might even have been born there. So his 2 daughters, they were born in Perak, and then they came with their family to Singapore around 1830, in the 1830s. So Seah Liang Seah's mother was in fact born in Southeast Asia, born in Perak. Number two, Seah Liang Seah was unlike his father, Seah Eu Chin. He was born in Singapore. Seah Eu Chin was born in China, in Yue-Pu village, in Chenghai prefecture. But Seah Liang Seah, on the other hand, was born in Singapore. Third fact, Seah Liang Seah was one of the founding members of the Straits Chinese British Association, or the SCBA in short. In 1900, the SCBA was founded to promote the interests of the Straits Chinese community, as well as in a way to express loyalty for British rule. That was the context at the time. Seah Liang Seah was the vice president of that organization. And as we know, that association eventually became what is known today as the Peranakan Association of Singapore. So he was one of the earliest founders, right? Fourth fact, academic Peng Po Seng in 1969 argued that descendants of Seah Liang Seah are Babas. And the fifth fact, according to the Peranakan Museum, when it was still open, Seah Liang Seah behaved like other Peranakans. I quote Dominic Lowe for the Peranakan Museum, quote, by having a photograph made of himself, Seah Liang Seah was engaging in an activity that was common amongst other Peranakans. Many Peranakans at the time were visiting professional studios to have their photographs taken, unquote. On the right-hand side, you can see the cabinet photo. This cabinet photo is from TPM's, the Peranakan Museum's Facebook. So you can see Seah Liang Seah smiling at you there, right? So, okay, as an American saying goes, if it talks like a duck, walks like a duck, smells like a duck, tastes like a duck, is it a duck? I don't know. But let's look at it even deeper. Seah Liang Seah was surrounded by close friends who included Sir Song Ong Siang and Tan Jiak Kim. Sir Song Ong Siang, born 1871, was, as you guys know, a famous lawyer, leader, the first Chinese to be knighted. He was a member of the Legislative Council also. He co-founded the SCBA with other Straits Chinese. Sir Song Ong Siang is most famous, arguably, for producing the book, The 100 Years History of the Chinese in Singapore. I want to share something interesting about it. If you read it, you would find that actually the focus of Sir Song Ong Siang's book to me was on the Straits Chinese. He focused more on the local Chinese in that sense. I thought that was pretty interesting. So of course, he did talk about the Malacca Chinese and the Chinese who were born in China. He also covered Seah Eu Chin. It was useful source material for my first book. But the main focus of it, if you read it, is on the Straits Chinese. And Sir Song Ong Siang was a close friend of Seah Liang Seah. On the other side of the picture, you have Tan Jiak Kim, born 1859, the grandson of the famous gentleman, Mr. Tan Kim Seng. So Tan Jiak Kim was the leader of the Hokkien community, and arguably Tan Jiak Kim was to the Hokkiens what Seah Liang Seah was to the Teochews. So Tan Jiak Kim represented the Teochew community at the same time that Seah Liang Seah represented the Teochew community. So Tan Jiak Kim Hokkien community, Seah Liang Seah Teochew community, I mean. He was also a member of the Legislative Council. Tan Jiak Kim was a wealthy businessman. He owned a company called Kim Seng & Co. He also co-founded the SCBA with other Straits Chinese. What's interesting too is that Tan Jiak Kim was a municipal commissioner at around the same time that Seah Liang Seah was also a municipal commissioner. So they were close colleagues and they represented different communities but worked hand in hand for the benefit of society. Okay, so now if you take a step back, well, so Seah Liang Seah is very involved in the culture. He's got a lot of Straits Chinese friends. I think very few people would argue that Sir Song Ong Siang and Tan Jiak Kim are not Peranakan, right? So, you know, he associated with the Peranakans. He was born here. His mother was born here. So if he talks like a duck, walks like a duck, speaks like a duck, tastes like a duck, has duck friends, is it a duck? I also don't know. So question remains open. And the reason for why I'm not so clear now, it's because actually this question of identity is a very sensitive and interesting one. So President Collin actually shared those recent discoveries and articles, right? I received the mail on the recent advances in DNA technology. And I read it with great interest. So President Collin was sharing essentially that, you know, after looking at the DNA, you find that there's a lot of interesting possibilities. But the DNA only tells you what the blood is. But then partly, I would argue that being Peranakan is also about the culture and about the history. So it's quite a complicated topic. In other words, not everybody who has Malay blood or Javanese blood is necessarily a Peranakan. It's largely, it's partly blood, but it's also largely culture, I would argue. So the difficulty for me in coming to a conclusion today, when I was so much more certain when I was younger, is because that there are many terms being used. So the first term is Baba Nonya. The second term is Straits born Chinese. The third term is Straits Chinese. And the last one is Peranakan. Often these terms are often used interchangeably. But what happens is that depending on who you ask, everybody has an opinion. You know, put 3 Babas in a room and you got 4 opinions. Huh? So number one, a Baba Nonya, to me, is a particular subgroup of local-born Chinese with unique characteristics. You've seen them on TV. The Seah Liang Seah, the Peranakan lady there, Joanne Pei's character, Baba Nonya. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is Straits-born Chinese. Those Chinese who were born in the Straits. So Malacca, Penang, and Singapore. If you take this view, then it's a slightly different one from the one used earlier. The third view is the Straits Chinese, who lived in the Straits, Chinese who lived in the Straits. So if you look at it that way, they could be Baba Nonya, a particular subgroup, or they could be Straits-born Chinese, SBC, or they could even be other people. It's also possible. Last but not least, you have Peranakan, and Peranakan just means local-born. So Peranakan can mean, if you are referring to the Peranakan Chinese or the Peranakan Cina, you could be referring to Baba Nonya, could be referring to Straits-born Chinese, or you could be referring to Straits Chinese. They all qualify. But commonly, people nowadays tend to refer to Peranakan in the sense of only Baba Nonya. So why have I added to the confusion? And the answer is because, to me, I think we have different identities. They are defined differently by different people, including ourselves, and they evolve over time. So if you ask me to land on an answer, I would say I don't really know, but arguably, Seah Liang Seah is a Peranakan. He's a local-born Chinese. He definitely didn't see himself as being, very pro-China. Okay, so that would be how I would approach the issue. Yeah, okay. I hope I haven't bored most of you. Okay, I swear, I'm getting to the fun part. So after a long and prosperous life, life full of excitement, in 1925, Seah Liang Seah passed away. When he passed away, he had one of the grandest funerals in Singapore. But I'm not going to talk about that. I think I'm going to talk about the more interesting part of his unusual will. Okay, wait, let me just jump ahead. When Seah Liang Seah passed away, he left behind an unusual will. The will was very unusual because it had what we call today a royal clause will. So in the royal clause, he declared that the inheritance, and it was massive, couldn't be disbursed until 21 years later, after King George V's longest surviving child had died. Okay, I know I lost most people at this sentence because I also lose myself from time to time. So it works like this. Seah Liang Seah said basically the will couldn't be disbursed unless King George, he passed away, right? Then all his children, all of them passed away, right? Plus 21 years after that, right? Then the will can be disbursed. So surprisingly, in 1996, when I was a young boy, my father ran to my room and said, John, come here. And I was like, what's going on? And then he showed me the newspaper, held up an article, said, what do you make of this? Then I read about it. Some strange fella, Seah Liang Seah, his will is being disbursed. Yeah, what's this got to do with us? And then he said, look, the chap died in 1925. So although he died in 1925, it was only in 1996 that the inheritance was disbursed. Unfortunately, by that time, there was only about 12 million left. You've got to remember that at the time when he was still alive, he had properties in Bedok, Tanah Merah, Sembawang, as I've just shared just now in the Sembawang Hot Springs. They own land in Boat Quay, North Boat Quay, land in River Valley Road. Basically, he owned a lot of land. Thompson Road, Bendemeer in Serangoon, right? So it was a lot of land, but by the time it had come to the year 1996, there was only $12 million left. When I looked at the will, it was pretty interesting because it wasn't just about this long delay before it was disbursed. Bear in mind, this was 1925, and in those days, women were not really respected. Women were taken, largely as property. But surprisingly, $450,000 was supposed to go to 100 people. The daughters, descendants. And so what happens is when you read it, you find that Seah Liang Seah was a pretty enlightened gentleman. Way back in the early 20th century and even in the 19th century, he was already thinking about setting aside some funding, not just for males, but also for the females' descendants. And he also said that his female children could live with it, in the properties even after he had passed away. So I think he was pretty enlightened man for his time. Given the context in those days where women didn't have as many rights as men back then, he was quite enlightened. And I think that is something quite heartening that I found. Okay, for all these good things that he did, Liang Seah Street at Bugis stands testimony to those who have come before us. So it's a reminder of his name. Most people think Liang Seah Street is about hot pot, dessert and good food. But to me, Liang Seah Street reminds us that there was once this very great man who not only left behind a great fortune and an interesting will, an unusual will, but he contributed to society and helped make Singapore partly the way it is today. So he did quite a lot for the contribution of Singapore towards Singapore. I thought I should also very quickly paint out my descendants' journey in the 21st century to share some of the background story on this. So how did I get inspired to write this? This is a question I often get asked. So actually, I've talked about this many times. I've spoken about Seah Liang Seah at the Confucian temple. The top left picture is basically of the Nanyang Sacred Union, one of the Seah family's many properties, but today it's a temple. I've spoken on Seah Liang Seah at the Peranakan Museum, the top right. Bottom left is interesting. That is Seah Eu Chin's grave. I've spoken at Seah Eu Chin's grave on several occasions. Seah Eu Chin's grave arguably is one of the largest, if not the largest tomb in Singapore. Some of you who are very well informed might know that Ong Sam Leong's tomb, the Hokkien Ong Sam Leong's tomb, is supposed to be the largest. But what happens is that it is the largest based on the surface area that you can see. So the difference between a Hokkien tomb and a Teochew tomb, I'm a nerd, so getting into details here, is that for a Hokkien tomb, basically what you see is what you get. But for a Teochew tomb, there is a back part to it, like a crypt. So I've been told by several brownies who research into Bukit Brown and tombs and stuff like that, that if you account for the back part, the crypt of the tomb, it's very well possible that Ong Sam Leong's tomb may not be the largest, or Seah Eu Chin could be as big as his, if not larger. So usually I'll tell people it is one of the largest tombs in Singapore. The tomb for Seah Eu Chin's tomb is so large that you can see in the picture there that there are 40 over people and they don't even cover the tomb, right? The second thing I'd like to share with you about that is in every Chinese tomb, there's usually a Tuti Gong. Tuti Gong is like an earth god or earth deity. The earth deity in a certain sense is there to, in a way, protect the tomb. I'm simplifying the culture here. But the Tuti Gong for Seah Eu Chin's tomb is larger than most people's actual graves in Bukit Brown. So think about that for a moment. That was how shockingly huge this amazing grave was at Grave Hill. On the bottom right, you can see me speaking in Chinese and struggling. I really pity those kind people who came to support me because I totally destroyed their ears. Okay, there's a Chinese saying, 我天不怕地不怕只怕土生华人说白话, which translated in English is, in English, the translation is, I'm not afraid of anything except a Peranakan fella speaking Chinese. Yeah, that's me. Okay, so when I was young, I was interested in the 4 streets that that were named after members of my family. The first one is Eu Chin Street, named after, of course, Seah Eu Chin. The second one was Liang Seah Street, of course, which I shared just now, named after Seah Liang Seah. The third one is Pek Seah Street, named after my direct ancestor, Seah Pek Seah. It's at Maxwell. And the last one is Seah Street, or Se Jie, named after our clan. I was very interested to find out more, so I used to ask my father, and he told me interesting stories about this. I pursued my passions further in the sense that when I was reading for my master's at the London School of Economics, I did a master's thesis on private order institutions in early colonial Singapore. Basically, I wrote about the not just my Seah family, but I also wrote about the Peranakan middleman traders, as well as the Chinese secret societies, and I got a distinction for this thesis. Interestingly enough, The inspiration came to me in a dream. I was sleeping, but not in class. I hastened to add that I was not sleeping in class. I was a hardworking student. One night when I was sleeping, the dream came to me. Shawn, why don't you write about your ancestors as well as the Peranakan middleman traders? See whether you can merge these two teams. I went to check it up, and voila, I had my thesis. So I managed to submit it early, and the professor was surprised. I don't want to tell him it came from a dream, worse then he might, think that supernatural intervention. After coming back to Singapore for my master's, actually writing took a back seat because although I was still interested in my family's history and the story of the 4 streets and the gentleman behind them, I decided that I wanted to focus on my career. But then in 2011, something happened. And that was LTA announced, the Land Transport Authority announced in September 2011, that they were going to build a road through Bukit Brown. Okay, this shows ignorance on my part. Before then, I didn't know what Bukit Brown was. I had no idea. But I followed this saga with great interest. So a bunch of Singaporeans banded together to protest this development. They said that it was important to preserve our heritage and they wanted the cemetery preserved. So, they basically took on the government. And I was so surprised. So I followed that in the newspaper. But I suppose this was the turning point for me. It was this point where I said to myself that I have to stand up and be counted. If I really want to write the story, it's got to be now or never. I'm going to put in effort into it. So basically, I started working in earnest on my manuscript, which eventually became my first book, then my second book, and so on. The impetus grew stronger in 2012, 1 year later. So in 2012, Seah Eu Chin's tomb was rediscovered. It was lost at Greyfield because after a while, many of us became Christians and some of us forgot where the tomb was. So over the many generations in Singapore, the tomb was lost. It once was lost, but now it was found. So 2 tombstone hunters, Charles and Raymond Goh, the tombstone hunters, Charles and Raymond Goh, found the tomb again. And I think this rediscovery also hit the headlines. Teochew pioneers' grave found in Toa Payoh. I was so inspired by it that it gave me greater motivation to complete my manuscript. So the first book you have on the left, after that became this book, and then later became Leader and Legislator. So I started producing more and more books. And I was motivated by the saying of Pindar, the famous Greek poet, unsung the noblest deed will die. Nobody will know what the ancestors achieved if nobody writes on them. So I first started with Seah Eu Chin, and then I later went on to produce the Leader and Legislator, the life of Seah Liang Seah, essentially. This is a photo I don't show most people, but you can see there was a prior version to it, right? And it was just terrible. So to have the support of the community, I'm forever grateful. I suppose the lesson here is to never give up despite the embarrassment and learn from our mistakes. And if you fall down 7 times, you should get up 8. I show you all these more primitive beta versions because the first one never made it to print. When I first started doing this, people laughed at me. I would get that very frequently. People said, this is impossible. First of all, nobody wants to read local history. Number 2, there's no interest, okay? And number 3, who the hell are you, right? So you're just a nobody. So when I first started out, even my father said, don't waste time. Nobody's going to be interested at all. But I kept at it. So the first book, it was quite terrible. Basically, I designed and built and did everything myself. Okay, that failed spectacularly. Then I came up with the middle version where the community was at least able and willing to support, and I got a grant from the National Heritage Board to help me. And then finally, it became more evolved into the more polished version, the second edition you see on the right. So I feel that this embarrassing episode of showing you all my failures, I think that's useful because you learn. The key lesson is that you never give up. If you feel strongly about something and it means something to you, I suppose you should put in effort to it. And I am a dinosaur. Yet I invented a website creatively titled SeahEuChin.com. Incidentally, I'm so creative that I did have a website for my author webpage, and guess what? It's called ShawnSeah.com. And because I'm very creative, if you want to read more about Seah Liang Seah, there's a tab creatively called Seah Liang Seah. So I think it's very obvious. I don't know. I find I'm a very straightforward person. I'm very frank. It does what it says on the bottle. So you go to SeahEuChin.com, and if you want to read more on Seah Liang Seah, you click on SeahLiangSeah.com. If you want to find out more about the grave, you click on Final Resting Place If you want to find out more about road names, you click on road names and so on. Yeah. People find this interesting, so I decided to put it up. This is the tomb. You go to final resting place and you can see it. There are many more images there. And if you ever have the chance to visit before it's finally gone, I would suggest that you go and see it one day. Might be worth a visit. Huh? But I couldn't have done it alone. I think at this note, I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you so much for coming down to listen to me. I also like to thank my volunteers and the community that supported me. I also need to thank the National Heritage Board, the Singapore Fund, the Singapore Bicentennial, the Peranakan Museum, the Seed Initiative, and the volunteers of Record and Reflect. So many organizations and institutions and people helped me along the way. One of them is here now. Actually, Josephine Chia is a famous author, and she's here to listen to the talk, right? But what she doesn't know is that once when I was at another talk and I bumped into her, she encouraged me. She probably didn't even remember that, right? Because, you know, who am I, right? So she says, no, you should continue doing it and keep up the good work. And then today I'm shortlisted and on the final list, on the short list for best non-fiction title. It's really been a dream come true. So I'm very grateful to all the people, because at many times I felt like giving up, you know. So they helped me. But so before I get to the Q&A part, which is really the interesting bit, I'd like to conclude with some reflections. To me, family history and personal stories are all part of the larger Singapore identity. I would like to share a quote by Mr. Ho Kwon Ping way back in 2015. The 13th century Persian poet Rumi once wrote something which should speak to all of us. He wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." In other words, you and I are not cogs in a machine or grains of sand or drops in the ocean. In each of us is the whole of Singapore. I thought that was very insightful. Basically, we are not a drop in the ocean. Rather, the entire ocean is in us in a drop. Each of us encapsulates what Singapore is like. So I put this montage together because to me it's very meaningful, and I'd like to share that with you. On the top left, you have Seah Eu Chin, my ancestor who came to Singapore in 1823. You have his two sons. He had many sons, 4 sons and 3 daughters, but I'm just showing the 2 sons that are more relevant to our case. Seah Liang Seah, his second son, and Seah Pek Seah, my direct ancestor. Seah Pek Seah had many children, and one of them was this gentleman here, this fierce-looking guy, top right, Mr. Seah Eng Kwang. Mr. Seah Eng Kwang was my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather had many children, and one of them was this gentleman here, bottom left, which is Mr. Stephen Seah. Next to Mr. Stephen Seah, you can see Miss Cecilia. This was my great-grandmother who came from the Riau, came from Indonesia. Then there were many children, of course, and then one of them was this gentleman here in the black and white photo, Mr. Simon Seah, my father. And he has 2 sons, Shawn and Shannon, and Shannon's not here today with us. He's busy working, making money. And here I am talking about local history, and that's me. And then as Gwen introduced, I have a beautiful daughter, Sarah. And this beautiful daughter, Sarah Seah, would be literally the 7th generation that we have here in Singapore. And so I thought this was a good place to end. So thanks for listening, and thank you for your patience. I know I have a different style from most people. Most people have a proper lecture, you know, learning objectives, you know, proper slides. But instead I had this more conversational sharing. I thought it would be better this way. And now I'd like to open up for questions and dialogue, and that might be more interesting. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Okay, over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you. Right. Okay. Yeah, since Shawn has invited conversational questions, you can unmute yourself and pose any questions that you have to him. For him. But in the meantime, Shawn, there is this particular question that has been put forth by Katie Chan. She actually shared a link regarding the big mentions. Yeah. And she asked the question, which are the 3 other mentions?
Okay. Thanks for this question. This is quite interesting. So there are four great mansions in colonial Singapore, or rather the Teochews built four great mansions, correct? The Si Da Chu. My Chinese is bad, so the pronunciation is probably wrong. Si Da Chu. So the first one was Seah Eu Chin's house at North Boat Quay. So the other three, I'm told, Tan Seng Po's house, the house of Wee Ah Hood, and the last one still stands today. It's the only one that stands today, is Tan Hiok Ni at Penang Road. So what's interesting is I thought to add on to this point is this: of the four great mansions in Singapore, the first one being Seah Eu Chin's house, the second one, Tan Seng Po's house at Hill Street. Tan Seng Po was the brother-in-law to Seah Eu Chin. So basically, the Seah family and the families remarried into own 2 out of 4 of the great mansions in the 19th century. So we're really crazy rich Asians. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Thanks. Yes, I'm sure. Katie would, yes, it's Katie's question. I'm sure you answered her question well. Okay, there is a question. Will there be another book coming up?
Oh, will there be another book coming up? Well, the answer is if there's a community support for it and there's enough appetite, I would love to do another book.
And what would that, any inkling on the title? Or
currently, I'm working on one on Peranakan identity, and it's slow going, especially because the topic is so complicated. I don't think I'll ever finish it, so probably I can discount that. I'm also working on another project where I talk about community stories in Siglap, but that's also slow going. So yeah. So actually, I'm working. Maybe I'll share with you my broad plan. My broad plan is that I cover different projects at one go, and I see which one is able to be supported by a community. Because of my training as an economist and as a historian, I don't just have the arts part. I also have the more commercial business part. And the sad fact remains this: if people don't buy your books, essentially, then you can't spread the message. You need there to have a market demand or a customer base. And this is something important that I like to share to those aspiring. You need a community to support you and to buy your product. Without the community, then essentially you are singing to nobody, you are speaking to nobody, and you are writing to nobody. So you need the community to back you up. So if there's community support for the projects that I'm doing and there's appetite, even if it is small and niche, I will still do it. And one way that I normally do this is when I table the proposals to the National Heritage Board, they will let me know in no uncertain terms whether I'm an idiot or not. So sometimes the National Heritage Board will say, this is a brilliant idea, then you know you're on the right track. And sometimes they scold you. Then you just take it. But I thought it's quite interesting. So to share a bit about this book, The Leader and Legislator one, it actually arose from a conversation I had with the National Heritage Board. At first, I thought there was no commercial interest in this, so people weren't really interested. So I actually wrote a much larger manuscript. I wanted to just have, Seah family in general. But the National Heritage Board said, no, actually, Seah Liang Seah is a pretty interesting character. If you're able to write one on him, we could support you, co-pay. So as a result, they sponsored about 50% of my cost. I had to fork up the cost up front. So I did that. And then it turns out that it was fairly well received. And the Singapore Bicentennial and the Singapore Fund came later to support the book. So I suppose what I'm really sharing is whether or not there's a new book really depends on our audiences. If the community feels that there's a need to do so and they have ideas, please share with me. And if the community feels that there's this direction you should be looking into, for example, Peranakan identity is something very current now and people are interested in it, then this is something where we as authors, we will look into it, research into it, and be the voice for those people who want their stories told. One of the questions I saw I'd like to address is what is the Hougang connection? So, okay, maybe I'll share a bit about that. The Hougang connection is a bit different. The Hougang connection to Seah Liang Seah and Seah Eu Chin is not what you probably had in mind, okay, because it's a bit different. And the answer is, Seah Eu Chin was very successful and wealthy. Seah Liang Seah was also very successful and wealthy. But along the way, by the time we came to my grandfather, to share a bit, my grandfather wasn't very rich, to put things mildly. Partly through wasting the wealth and partly through living through the world wars, the Great Depression, the Japanese occupation and all that, as well as taking back of the land by the Singapore government. By the end of the day, there really wasn't much left for my family in the end. And so my grandfather basically lived on a small land in Aokang. And so my father grew up there in the kampong, and then slowly he built up his own knowledge and his wealth. And then, so today we are middle class again. So, you know, kind of like rags to riches to rags again, then to, you know, not riches. I don't think anybody today can own what Seah Eu Chin and Seah Liang Seah did. What they have done is really incredible, and could only be possible with the colonial structure at the time. I don't think it can be replicated today. I think nobody would stand for a situation where one person has maybe 20–30% of all the wealth in Singapore. I don't think anybody can stand for that today. But at least having said that, you know, it was an interesting story and something to, you know, motivate future generations by. Not so much the wealth for me. For me, more of the inspiration will come from the contributions that they did, what they did with the wealth. How they built up institutions like the Nian Kongsi, like the Peranakan Association, how they donated to charitable causes, how they set up schools and all that. I think that to me was the bigger contribution. Yeah, and so that's something I try to live by. In my on weekends I'm a writer, but on weekdays I'm a public servant. So I've served in several ministries, education, defense, manpower, and in my day job, I hope that I can help to take care of my fellow Singaporeans. Is something I feel strongly about. So the answer to, was there an Aokang connection? Well, we lost most of our wealth, at least my part of the family. There are other parts of the family who did much better and are still rich today. You might want to go and ask them to borrow money. But for our family, not so much. So my grandfather was not very successful. In my Aokang book, which you should support, okay, a quick blatant plug, please support this book, the Aokang one. I share a story about my grandfather. While he still had money, he wanted to set up a cinema. So this poor gentleman decided to take on the empire, not the British Empire, the Empire Theatre at Lowland Road. So he set up his own cinema nearby, trying to wipe out the empire. His idea was, I will undercut you, you know. Okay, so he filmed, he casted Western movies those art house movies and eventually lost all his money. All right, he also lost the money of his business partners. So let's just say grandpa wasn't very good at doing business. He didn't have the acumen. And although that sounds harsh, it was true. He was a kind, loving gentleman, but he was no businessman. Okay, so, well, the only connection, we lost everything, and so we live in a kampong. My father made good, moved out of the kampong, today stays in Siglap. Hence, you can see the link about what's coming up for my next book. So basically, I try to write stories that are related to what I know or what I'm interested in, and I try to expand it. Robert Yeo, the famous playwright, told me that because I've written family history and not written community history, maybe the third one I could do Singapore history. But I feel that's a bit ambitious because basically I'm just a normal citizen. I'm not a minister. I'm not some high level government person or whatever. I'm just a normal citizen. So writing a history of Singapore is a bit out of my league. So, you know, I'm focusing on areas where I've lived before, organizations I've joined, you know, stuff like that. Might be more fun that way. Yeah. Sorry, I hope you don't feel disappointed.
Okay. Moving down, there's other questions that when they're asking, you mentioned, okay, this is from Daisy Chua. It says that you mentioned that to be a Peranakan involves blood and culture. How do you verify the culture bit in a person so that she will not be accused of culture appropriation?
Oh, this is a good question.
In your context.
In my context.
Yeah.
So maybe I just share my personal view.
Yeah.
For this one, I don't think there's a real answer. So I'm just sharing my personal view. My personal view is that blood is one thing, because I'm pretty sure that there are some Peranakans out there. I think according to the research, and President Colin can correct me if I'm wrong, I read it, you said about 10% are pure Chinese, right? It's possible, I would say so. 10% pure Chinese seems about reasonable to me. But blood shouldn't be the main determinant. I would go so far as to argue even clothing shouldn't be the main determinant. Just because just now you saw my ama, my great grand ama wearing a Nonya dress doesn't imply that she was Nonya. It could very well be, you know, on that day she decided to dress special. So from a historical evidence point of view, it is true. You really can't take it that literally. So when you want to assess a person's level of cultural, you know, ability, or whether the person is very in tune with culture, the answer is very difficult to tell. And even for those who are very well versed with the culture, it may be a little sliver of the culture. So, for example, you might be very good at pantun, and that's all you know. It's entirely possible. And for example, you could be really good in knowing the Baba history, Baba culture. You know about Hang Lipo, everything. But on the other hand, you can't speak Malay for your life, or the patois in your life to save you. Or you could be very fluent in the Puata, in the Baba language, only to find that actually you've been speaking a variant of it, right? And then some people argue, to really have the pure culture, you need to be a Hokkien. I think that's a bit divisive, and that's a bit not so exclusive. So it depends also on whether you take a broader or a narrower view. So I'm more inclined to take a broader view. What is being Peranakan really? It is about being accepting of different cultures, okay, being able to, you know, move in smoothly between Angmo and English all. It is about accepting that, there are people from different backgrounds. And it's about being Chinese, but not really Chinese, and Malay, but not really Malay. Yeah, so I think it's very, so to answer your question, it's very difficult to tell. So even I can't tell. But maybe I share an anecdote, okay? Two anecdotes. Number one, I don't think that I'm very Peranakan, but people tell me that I am. Number one, once somebody from the Peranakan Museum many years ago asked me, is it okay if I record your voice? So I asked, why you want to record my voice, Simi? And the person said, it's because you have a very unique Baba voice. Did you know your accent is very Baba? Can I record it? Okay, so number one, someone said so, not I say one. And number two, I was serving my NS, because I'm no choice, Singaporean must serve NS, right? So I was lining up to surrender my pink IC. For those of you who haven't served NS because you don't have brothers in the army or sons in the army, you have to surrender your pink card and then they give you a green card. I don't know why, it's just the culture all. So I was lining up to hand in my pink IC. The chief clerk at the counter gave me the green card and then suddenly she paused and said, "Orang Cina, bukan Cina," in my face, So, so not that I say I'm Baba, people say I'm Baba, so okay, fine. If people think you look like a duck, talk like a duck, sound like a duck, taste like a duck, are you a duck? But there are also family members of mine who consider themselves Chinese. Yeah, but I also have to add that this topic is very complicated. It's not something that, you could solve over a 1.5 hour talk on a Sunday. It's a sort of thing that will require repeated conversations. Is the Peranakan a product of the past? He has come and gone and he's dead? Or is being Peranakan a living culture where the culture evolves with the times? And what it means to be Peranakan today is different from being Peranakan in the past? Or is Peranakan culture an essential thing? That means, quintessentially it is ABC and die you must have this DNA in you, or is it a blood thing? So I think these are all interesting questions that we have to explore.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah, call it over to
Sure.
you.
Yeah. I think this is a really fantastic talk, and really, Shawn, I think you can probably write a few volumes on Peranakan identity based on what you said. But just to cut things short, I'd just like to remind all our friends here who's attending this webinar that if you look out for my upcoming monthly letter to members, we're going to talk about identity, cultural identity, ethnic identity, etc. A little bit more elaboration, but in connection with the convention, that the 33rd Baba Nyonya International Convention that we're going to have 20th November. We're going to have a lot about identity and about keeping the culture alive. So I think with that, I'll just give it back to Gwen to conclude.
Okay.
today's very interesting webinar. Thanks again, Sean.
So
Thank
before
you.
we conclude, I'll take the last question by Henry Chan. Are you by chance related to Seah Eu Chin from Penang?
So I get this every week. Someone asks me, "Do you know some other Seah?" And
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know him. In all probability, any Seah I won't know them. The reason is we have at least 1,000 Seahs in Singapore and more tens of thousands in Johor and China and elsewhere. There's even a Singapore Seah Clan Association, of which I don't know everyone. So I'm really sorry. No, I don't know. I thought maybe on this note, I would like to switch direction a bit and say thank you very much to President Colin for having me, Gwen for actually arranging this talk. I think people may not know that Gwen actually has been in discussions with me for this talk for a long time because of COVID. And much as I would have loved to do it in person and see all of you and interact, it's a pity we couldn't do that. But I suppose this is a nice substitute.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Gwen and Colin and the Peranakan Association colleagues for having me. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope that what I share at least has been interesting. At least you enjoyed your weekend listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, Sean, for joining us. And I think I'm going to borrow your line that you have said that put 3 babas in the room and you get 4 opinions. My God, how true that is. I'll take that away. That's my takeaway. To all, thank you again for joining us. And on the chat group, on the chat site, we have feedback. Do complete the feedback form and also vote for Sean's book. Yeah, we have provided the link as well in the chat group. So thank you all and have a good afternoon and stay safe. Till the next time we see each other. Bye. Bye-bye.